Kind of relevant to our time and my work since that time. Terence had this fascination, and I was mentioned a bit earlier by one of you, the idea of novelty. And he read a number of books on this to inform himself. And the man had like 3,000 books in his home at all times, and he had read all of them. He was a very rare bird in this sense. And one of the books that he read was Alfred North Whitehead's Process Philosophy, which I've now become very, very fascinated with. Whitehead talks about there are no objects. So this is a mathematician physicist from the 1920s who came up with a radically different philosophy of reality that was informed by the birth of quantum mechanical theory at the time and his contemporaries. It's a fascinating way of looking at the world, that objects compress out of previous events, and then they are subjectively present in some way, and then they kind of dump their data for the next moment. So even an atom is a thing that is in a stream. It's like a stone or a twig in a stream that's going along, and that everything's connected to everything else. And Whitehead has become, I think he's the philosopher of our age. We're in the network age of this meme stream and continuous interruptions to our patterns of thought, such that our patterns of thought are interruptions. And so Whitehead is fascinating, and Terence used Whitehead's term concrescence into novelty. So this is where you get this wonderful novelty that he would talk about. It came from his fascination with, the time wave of, are there more complex things happening that join with each other to create, to stack and create more complex things? And we had a conversation on this late one night in the late 90s, and I got pretty fascinated about it. I was very interested in the question of the origin of life since I was a teenager, and this was one more data. This was like a man that was a serious thinker who's little outside of academia, very outside of academia, but a real seeker to what makes things more complex. So 6 or 7 years later, when I finally returned to do my PhD work, I chose the theme of what is complexification into novelty, and built an entire simulation engine which ran at UC San Diego for 6 months to try to find the formula for how the universe gets things together and complexifies and doesn't lose those patterns. And it was called the evolution grid, or Evo grid. And we found what I call the cosmic wiggle. And Terence had this idea of the cosmic giggle, remember? That is so fun to recall that meme. But the cosmic wiggle, in Terence's honor, was the staircase climbing curve where bonds were forming in trillions and trillions of atomistic individual atoms flying around in a simulation engine at UC San Diego, and some form bonds, but not many. But the ones that form bonds are used as a seed for the next simulation round. So you end up, we don't even know the properties that allowed that volume to form bonds, but we just take it, wiggle it around, shake it around, but start with similar conditions, and then we find more bonds form faster and faster, and it's non-linear. And despite the fact that we're throwing a ton of heat in there, we're not breaking those bonds at a rate that would take the system down to what's called equilibrium. And that's how I defended my PhD thesis in 2011, got my PhD, and went on to apply that to the origin of life itself, meeting Dave Deemer at UC Santa Cruz, where I'm now a researcher. In a sense, that conversation with Terence started a bunch of balls and bunch of marbles rolling down a plank, which led to an onrushing effort to say, what is novelty? Can we find a formula for it? That the universe collects things together into more complex things, holds on to them, doesn't let them go, and then the stacking can occur. And it's the same formula that stars are forming heavier elements from. It's the same formula that would apply to the origin of life. It's the same formula that applies to the concrescence of cultural artifacts and systems of organization. Same through line, all the way through from cosmogenesis to biogenesis to maybe conscious genesis. And then on top of all of this, and this is sort of the exciting thing, we found a way to do it chemically. We found a system, we call it the hot spring hypothesis. It's wet-dry cycling in a hot spring pool, and have done the chemistry to form little sacs called protocells that contain various long lengths, chain lengths of polymers called RNA from de novo components, from the monomer building blocks. We can then cycle these things through wet and dry and moist phases, just as you would do taking a shower. You know, and the bathtub dries down or partially drains out, and you get a bathtub ring of solutes and fatty lipids on the side. That's the chemical engine that gives you the polymers that you need. So we found a way that nature would have had to make at random the polymers that life needed to get started, and then a system to cycle all those polymers in these sacs called protocells through selection barriers. And this is a form of selection before Darwinian selection that had to exist. We may have found the bootstrap of life itself. And that's been published. It was the cover of Scientific American 3 years ago. Then it was on the cover of Astrobiology a year ago, and in a feature article in Nature in December. And numerous publications and a dozen universities now working on testing various aspects of this whole hypothesis, which you can download if you put in hot spring hypothesis for an origin of life. You can get the article, and it's all illustrated and whatnot. And if Terence was here in 2021, I would sit with him in his library and go through it step by step and say, Terence, here is what we think the formula for concrescence into novelty is, because we think it's the thing that led, a jumble of organic polymers and things like that to across a chasm to being self-organizing, self-maintaining living cells. It was in a sense the philosopher's stone at the lowest level, or the elixir, or you would call it. He would have various names from it for hermetic studies, but he would have been very satisfied, gotten his head around it, and be able to comment on it and bring it out to the culture. The big philosophical role for the 2020s is that the progenote, which is this mass of self-assembled but passive protocells, is so flimsy and wobbly when you look at it in a vial or under a microscope slide. It's just, there's nothing going on there. So an individual protocell basically falls apart in solution. A clump of protocells stay together a long time, and they hold their polymers. So what we predict is that life started in a clump. It started in a networked effect of chemical circuits in the progenote, in the aggregate of protocells through sharing. Because you can't have competition bred in tooth and claw, survival of the fittest of individual organisms before organisms have even the faintest ability to maintain their internal states. But a clump of things that are barely alive is a thing that is more alive. So the aliveness and robustness of the clump of those first fragile protocells is enhanced by their clumping together and co-reliance. And this could mean that the start of life was a deeply collaborative, sharing and communal process. And that if we look through that lens in the 2020s, we're working with evolutionary biologists now in the UK and elsewhere to sort of work on the extended evolutionary synthesis that's going on right now. But if you look through that lens, you can start to see the world differently. You start to see that instead of the Victorian idea of survival of the fittest, the beasts on the plains of Africa, that the actual plains of Africa, with mycelial layers and infinite numbers of microbial communities, infinite root reconnections, is the collaborative layer upon which the circus or the theater of these Serengeti animals plays out. But the fundamental thing they're standing on is deeply collaborative. It's forests, it's water systems, it's Gaia, effectively. So perhaps the Victorians they got it partially right, but not all of it. They didn't understand the microbial consortia. They didn't understand cell biology. So life isn't all about survival of the fittest. It's not all about, competition red in tooth and claw. It's largely about maintaining a healthy substrate upon which everything can thrive. And if we can roll that from science, just as relativity theory in 1919, 1921 became a huge role for modernism in the 20s. The idea that everything was relative, even time could change shape and change pace. Space had shape, and things were relative to your frame of reference. And that was an idea that came into theater and politics and economics, into modernism of the 1920s. Perhaps this idea that life started as a deep collaborative unit and only thrives through it can roll from core reductionist, hard-headed chemistry and geochemistry and origin of life. It can roll into the culture like, wake up, people. We have to make sure our networks of trust, collaboration in our biosphere, in our families, in our children as they grow up, they must be healthy. That is primal. So that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you for that prompt as to the meaning of this discovery. Well, the interesting thing is I'm currently in collaboration with Matt Segal of California Institute of Integral Studies, who's a wonderful Whitehead scholar. And he's connected me with the Cobb Center at Claremont and all these other thinkers. And they have what they call Panexperientialism, which is, I think, Whitehead's version of panpsychism. And what we're going to argue, we've decided to take opposing positions. So he's going to take the position that Whitehead did, which was something like consciousness or experience or feeling, and that feeling is different for an atom than a person, is primal and fundamental, and that matter and all these things, objects emerge from that. I'm going to take the position that no, it's bolts to the metal. It's from what the universe makes as a machine, as a factory, and then you get the origin of life, and then you get massive network systems, complexity, and growth into bigger, higher energy using animals, neurons, and you get a very massive interconnected system we call the PIM model, probability, interconnection, and memory, cycling at all scales over 4 billion years, lifting everything to a potential point 4 billion years off normal. And that this alone, this position that we're in, and the sheer amount of shit that's going on, as Terence might say it, is sufficient to explain what we think of as consciousness, numinous experience. Even the psychedelic downloads we get are from within this field that is made by life, and it's made from the lowest level all the way to the top, and there's no need for an external, say, the external manipulator, creator, and that there's no need for experience, in a sense, a panpsychist view, which is saying that somewhere else there is a super etheric force that we don't see yet. And in a sense, position I'm going to argue is that it's all around us. It's what we are. We need to look closer at life itself, not take our eyes off the ball, off of the the molecular biology and the planetary systems. Those are the places that are going to show us what conscious experience is, more than creating another kind of a stand-in, which would be another approach for what creates the stuff of reality. And that this environment is so information rich. There's so much stuff to watch out for. There's so much interaction between at all levels of the body, the nervous system, that it's enough to drive an organism toward complex emergence and cognition. And Ardipithecus, which we knew she was walking the forest floor and she had the ability to climb trees and pick fruit, but she was upright. She was not on the savannah. Some of our oldest ancestors that did walk upright, at least part of the time, lived in the rainforest. So the rainforest hadn't receded yet. So I think of the rainforest and then, of course, the savannah is enough to drive all of the evolutionary processes toward cognition, toward language. But that's just my kind of reductionist. Let's go to the published articles and check it out. My share of numinous experiences that that blew my mind, that came from some other place. But in a sense, I don't attach to them. I attach to them not as I was just shown something so far outside of human experience that there must be some bigger thing. I attach to them of like, okay, that just happened. I'm an engineer at heart. How can I figure out an explanation for what made that happen, what made that movie reel play, and what were the messages in the movie reel? And so I started using that movie reel to solve some of these problems. So I used these extenuated states to work on the origin of life with that numinous state and whatever showed up there, whether it's an entity, it's entitied, or whether it's myself, I have no idea, but I would write contracts and agreements and go into that world, a relationship to bring back solutions. And Terence used to talk about if the machine elves could give us a shiny object that we could bring back to reality and show to the world, we would just blow people's minds. So instead of the shiny object, I've been trying to bring back, and it's been a little bit successful, visions of these basic questions of how did life begin. And I'm not 100%, but partially using the entry into those states. So I'm very much the engineer that wants to figure out the code that is running under there, because if we can figure that code out, we can use those numinous states tremendously powerfully for our future, for our survival, for thriving. If we can learn the code of creating them and of surfing in them, but not otherize them, not really own them, really own the relationship with them. So that's just my philosophy over the whole thing. At the SAND conference in 2017, if you look up Bruce Damer, Science and Non-Duality keynote, or wherever it was Origin of Life and Consciousness. For that crowd, that audience, which would include Donald Hoffman, I held up a rock, a stromatolite from the Pilbara 3 billion years ago that has these layers in it, and that's evidence for life on the old Earth's crust, the Archean crust. And I said, I know this group likes the ground, and I got a big laugh about that. But this is our common ancestor. What I'm holding in my hand is some of the oldest evidence of where we began, and I handed it out to all 600 people, passed it around, and I said, if we ground ourselves in what this is, and we don't do so much conjecture that's too far from where we came from, we may find some amazing new insights, because science is just delivering us cosmology, it's delivering us incredible insights, and I think there's enough there to rework our understanding, which has only partially been reworked, onto a basis of evidence and of beautiful, solid model making that's testable. I think that's, for me, that's the richest path. That's the path that's always going to deliver. And it's really, really reductive reasoning. And that's why it's satisfying for gearhead people, kind of like me. If you take what's effectively a little soap bubble, which is a lipid bilayer that came from a meteoritic source, your monomers could be amino acids from also that meteoritic source, or generated in the atmosphere or through photochemistry. And your monomers of things like nucleic acids and peptides, and you throw it in a solution and cycle it, you can get it all together. You can form these little things called protocells through wet-dry cycling. But those things are really flimsy. If you throw them into solution and you stir it up, you're going to burst those little compartments, and nothing's going to happen. But what happens miraculously, unexpectedly, is the little pool that you threw them into dries up during the day, gets them all together in a sludge. They form a unit, an aggregate, and then even dry down together, and then the synthesis of new polymers can occur. And it is the sludge, the ignoble sludge, that we perhaps started with, the ignoble sludge. And because together, the power of those protocells together is much greater to remain stable than it is to have them free floating in solution. And so that's a basic fundamental principle that I believe carries through all of life, all the way up to us and human civilization. If we break the bonds of interconnection, if we get isolated into groups, we lower our probabilistic ability to solve problems. And if we start corrupting memory of our culture, we start creating fake news and fake histories and fake elections and whatever we want to create, we break the very system that drives life, that sourced life in the first place, this thing we're calling PIM. We make it weaker and we'll fall. And so the system understanding of incredible codependence and surfing resources and sharing them, which operates at all scales in life, if we deeply grok that, we will survive, and we will be able to steward the earth, and we'll be able to actually enter into long-term habitation in space and create more living space for life.